This is the first video in a new series directed at people who would like to engage in self-directed study of great thinkers, texts, and topics in the field of philosophy, which is my area of specialization. I get asked quite frequently by viewers, subscribers, fans, people who come to my talks, how can I study philosophy on my own? Is that possible for me? Is it feasible? Or do I need to go to a college and a university or sign up for some MOOC or something along those lines? Is it really possible for me? And the answer is yes. Anybody can study philosophy, but there are a lot of things to keep in mind. And people then immediately ask, well, where should I start? And my answer is almost always, let's start with Plato. Plato, there's a lot of reasons why we should begin with him, and I'm going to talk about that in a bit. So this video is just about Plato and what you might think about or take into consideration as you're beginning your studies or continuing your studies, as you're approaching his texts, as you're digging into the dialogues. I'm going to give you some useful, at least I hope it's useful for you, advice and pointers, and bring up some things that you might otherwise miss. And I'm drawing upon about 20 years of teaching Plato. I guess you could say that I have about 30 years experience of reading Plato, or maybe even longer. I'd have to think about exactly when it started, because I know I got introduced to Plato in high school. And I've been helping people outside of the field of academic philosophy engage with philosophical thinkers and texts, I'd say about the last 10 years. So I've got some ideas in mind that might be helpful for you. I'm going to be bringing up a lot of different points in no particular order. If you find something in here that's not particularly interesting, just skip ahead. But hopefully all of it should be useful for at least somebody. The first topic that we should think about is, well, why should we study Plato in the first place? Meaning, not just why should we study Plato at all, but why should Plato be one of the first philosophers who we examine? Why not start with some 20th or 21st century thinkers, somebody who's really contemporary? Or why not branch out into the wider world of non-Western philosophy and maybe look at, Confucius or Lao Tzu or some other writings? Or why not start, if we're going to begin with Western philosophy, Plato's not the first philosopher, why not begin with the people that we call the pre-Socratics? And there are some good reasons for this. When it comes to the contemporary stuff, philosophy is a conversation that's been going on here in the West for over 2,000 years, and you can find some stuff in the present that doesn't really connect up much with philosophy's history, but much of what you would encounter will have some reference to the past. So it's not always helpful to jump right into the newest stuff. The newest is not always the best when it comes to philosophy. When it comes to what we might call world philosophy or comparative philosophy or non-Western philosophy, there's nothing preventing you from doing that. But if you want to study Western philosophy, which is what I can help you with, because I'm not an expert in comparative or non-Western philosophy, I think Plato is a really good place to begin. And you might say, well, that's all fine, but I know that there were some other thinkers before Plato, these pre-Socratics, like Heraclitus, who I might have heard of, or Parmenides, or Pythagoras. And yes, that's quite true. But when it comes to possessing full texts, Plato's really the beginning. We don't have more than fragments or very short selections from most of these pre-Socratic thinkers. And as a matter of fact, a lot of what we know about them comes to us through Plato, perhaps mediated through Socrates, Plato's great teacher, and his reflections on it, or perhaps Plato's own study of these thinkers. And so if we want to begin from a fairly systematic beginning point, Plato's more the place to start. You're going to get plenty of the pre-Socratics in studying Plato, and there's nothing to prevent you from going back and reading them anyway. But I think that Plato is really a good starting point. So he's really the first developed philosophical thought that we have access to. Now, we could have some great discovery and find Heraclitus's treatise on nature, or Democritus, or Pythagorean writings or something like that. That could happen, but until it does, Plato is really the place for us to begin with. Another key thing that I think recommends Plato is you're really getting a double whammy. You're getting a lot of Plato's views, but you're also getting some representative discussion of his teacher Socrates, who is a major thinker of the early Western world. And not just in terms of Platonism, Socrates had a number of different followers who each, established their own school. We don't have a lot, unfortunately, of some of the what we call minor Socratic schools, like the Cynics and the Cyrenaic hedonist school, or the Megarian dialectical school. But we do have, Xenophon, who was another student of Socrates, and we can kind of take Plato and Xenophon and compare them and contrast them and get a composite picture of this guy, Socrates. But our most developed picture of Socrates is really coming through Plato. And so when you read about Socrates in the Platonic dialogues, you can get a good sense of who this person was and why he mattered so much. Plato is also going to be referenced by many other philosophers. Love him or hate him, they're talking about Plato. It's not quite true to say, as Alfred North Whitehead apparently did, that philosophy is a set of footnotes to Plato. That's going too far. There's a lot of originality and new ideas coming about through other thinkers, including Plato's own student, Aristotle, who founds his own school. But Plato is an absolutely central partner in the conversation that is philosophy, and indeed culture in general in the West, going up to the present. Like I said, whether you agree with Plato or whether you think that he's the origin of all sorts of problems and misunderstandings, the way some philosophers do portray him, like, for example, Friedrich Nietzsche, he's somebody you need to know. He's somebody who is worth studying so that you have a good sense of what's going on in philosophy. So those are some good reasons to study Plato. I would say that there's a few others that we might bring up. One is that we're going to talk about this a little bit more when we go into what a dialogue consists of. What's really cool about Plato's dialogues is that they're genuine dialogues. They're not just, you might say, pasteboard characters who don't really disagree with each other or embody some sort of point of view. You'll get to learn a lot about, you might say, ancient Athens and Greece in general, and different ways of approaching issues and problems, not just in philosophy. I mean, you're getting a lot of, as I said, pre-Socratic philosophers and the people that we call the sophists and rhetoricians. You're also getting military leaders. You're also getting people who are cultural producers, who are trying to explain or produce poetry. You're getting craftspeople. You're getting all sorts of people represented in these Socratic dialogues. And so, we get to try out a number of different ways of looking at the world, and they come into conflict and conversation with each other. In Plato, you will find some very central problems and questions and topics of philosophy being raised. For example, what is knowledge? Plato sets the bar rather high, but he is at least approaching the problem in a constructive way. Or who should run the political system? Or what are the virtues and what are the vices? Or how do we become good people? These are all just a few of the many different philosophical topics that Plato is addressing. I'll just throw one more in there that I think is particularly important. What are universals? When we say that, I'm a human being and you're a human being, what's the human beingness that we have in common? That's a really central problem that Plato addresses in terms of what he calls the forms or ideas. So there are central problems or issues or topics that you'll get introduced to in studying Plato. His works are very challenging, but they're also incredibly rich and rewarding, and you can study them really the rest of your life if you wanted to. So there's no sense in delaying. Why not just jump right in? The other thing that I think is really great about Plato is if you're studying the Platonic dialogues, you're going to be attending to assumptions that people are making and arguments and distinctions and getting introduced to concepts. You're acquiring the toolkit that you'll need in order to do philosophy in relation to other people. So these are all some great reasons for beginning with Plato. As you're beginning, there are some very practical questions about texts that we should get out of the way. The first thing that people want to know is which dialogues, which works by Plato should I be reading first? And, the answer to that is you can really start anywhere you like. You're not going to hurt yourself by beginning with the Republic or the Symposium or even with the, late work like the Laws. That said, I think that there are some dialogues that are easier for beginners to wrap their heads around and see where Plato's going and get some sense of, what the Platonic project as a whole is. Other people may recommend different reading orders, and that's perfectly fine. I'm just going to give you the one that I particularly like, and I will point out that it's not exactly the same as what I do in like my Introduction to Philosophy classes or Foundations in Philosophy when I'm teaching it in an academic institution. But for self-study, here's the order that I think is, for many people, going to be the most productive. Start with 2 dialogues. One of them is really, really short and a bit confusing, but you can figure it out. And it's called the Ion. And the other one is a bit longer. There's a bit more going on in there. Also probably going to be confusing at first, but you'll puzzle it out. And that is called the Meno. Why do I pick these 2 dialogues? Well, they're both fairly, early, and they are part of a chronology where you get to see things happening with Socrates. The Meno is a later dialogue as far as its composition, but it fits into this nice narrative that we see going on. And they both deal with a fundamental set of questions. Who actually knows what the hell they're talking about? Who has knowledge? Episteme in Greek. And the answer isn't made completely clear, but at least we get to take some people off the stage and say, well, these people don't know what they're talking about. In the Ion, which is the shortest of the dialogues, Socrates is talking with a guy named Ion, which is why it's called the Ion. And Ion is a rhapsode. He's explaining what it is that he does, which is to go around and interpret Homer's poetry. And Socrates asks him some pointed questions. And it turns out that what Ion does, he's doing not by knowledge, but by something like divine enthusiasm or a communication of emotion. So there's some really interesting stuff going on there. The Meno, which is a little bit longer, named after another guy, Meno, a friend of Socrates, involves a lot of discussion about the nature of virtue and whether virtue is something that can be taught. Can we define virtue? It turns out in that dialogue they're not able to come to a definition, but eventually in other dialogues they do. And these are really great starting points. In it you also see foreshadowing of Socrates' trial and death, because there's a guy who shows up, Anytus, and he and Socrates get into a little bit of a tiff with each other. After you've read those dialogues, and when I say read them, I don't mean reading them once. I mean reading them through a number of times and studying them and mulling them over. Then I would say you're ready to move on to a new sequence of dialogues. And there I would begin with a set that you can often find in the last days of Socrates. Those would be the Euthyphro, the Apology, the Credo, and the Phaedo. Why are all these associated with each other? Because they have to do with Socrates' trial and his condemnation and his eventual execution. The Euthyphro deals with the question of what piety is, because Socrates is being accused of impiety, and the Apology is his defense speech, which doesn't defend him all that well, but lays out a lot of the doctrines, and again explores issues of knowledge, and who has it and who doesn't, why Socrates is a wise person, even though he doesn't know very much, and some of Socrates' views on death. And then the Credo has to do with whether he should take the opportunity to slip away from the prison cell that he's awaiting his execution in because his friend Credo bribed the jailers, or whether it be wrong to do so. Finally, the Phaedo is a really long and great dialogue, introduces a lot of Platonic concepts, and depicts the death of Socrates. On the day that he died, he was having conversations with his friends about the immortality of the soul and arguments for it and against it, and the nature of philosophy and the relation between the soul and the body. So those 6 dialogues, great starting point. Now, where do you go after that? Well, you have a lot of different options. If you're particularly interested in the question of language and rhetoric, you might read the Gorgias and the Protagoras and other dialogues like the Cratylus. If you want to dive right into the Republic, which is one of the longest and, in some respects, best works of Plato, there's nothing to prevent you from doing that. You might also go another route and look at the dialogues on friendship and love, which would be the Lysis, the Symposium, which is one of the finest works of Western literature, and the Phaedrus. It doesn't really matter, I think, too much which order you read them in. People get very worked up about, it's got to be in the right order. You're not going to hurt yourself by reading books out of order, because you have to remember, you're going to go back and reread these over and over and over again. So don't get too preoccupied with that. It really depends on what you're particularly interested in. Then we can think about questions of what book should I actually get? Let's get down to the nitty-gritty. Do I get this translation or this translation or this translation? And again, people get very concerned about having the right version. There is no right version. I'll tell you, as somebody who's engaged in a lot of translation work, you're never truly happy as a translator with the translation that you make of things from one language to another. And, you can find translations that are good in one respect but not good in another. You're almost better off actually comparing them with each other if you can't read it in the original Greek. And Plato's Greek, by the way, is quite hard. It's demanding. You don't have to be overly concerned about it. What you really want to do is make sure that you have access to multiple versions and that you can find a translation that's readable for you. Now, one of the things that I do recommend is getting an anthology. And I have an older anthology here, which is edited by Edith Hamilton and Huntington Cairns. This was sort of the standard version back when I was in graduate school. It's got most of Plato's dialogues, certainly all the ones that are actually attributed to him, and even some dialogues that we think, might not actually be by Plato. You can notice it's been quite, footnoted, not footnoted, but post-it noted for me, because I use this quite a lot. And it gets it's this sort of thin paper that you see in big, thick books. This is not a bad version to have. There is a more recent set of translations that you can also get in anthology form, edited by, if I remember right, Cooper and Annis. And I'll put links to both of those in the video below. Again, don't get too preoccupied about having the right text. It's important just to get your hands on some Plato. And, you don't necessarily have to buy it. You can find Plato at your local library. Very, very commonly, right? You might even find an anthology like this. You can also find Plato online. There are a lot of Platonic texts available in a variety of different translations and sources. There's even something that's called the Perseus Project that will allow you to, if you want to look at the Greek, you can do that in the Perseus Project website, which is hosted by Tufts University. So you don't have to worry too much about which translations or which editions. The key thing is to get yourself something that works for you. People are also quite concerned, very typically, with secondary literature. And I think a lot of this comes out of the feeling that, I don't know if I'm really up to reading Plato. It's challenging work. He's got such a great reputation. Who am I to approach Plato and make sense of it? I don't know that I'll actually get that much out of it. Maybe I should read an Intro to Philosophy or a History of Philosophy or something like that. And if you want to do that, there's nothing wrong with that. I always tell people, including my face-to-face students and online students, that with the right resources, with the right support, anybody can study philosophy. But if you want secondary literature, there's certainly plenty of it out there. I actually picked out a few things off of my bookshelf, two very different writers and approaches. Like here's Gregory Vlastos's Socrates, Ironist and Moral Philosopher. Vlastos is an academic, and he takes a very analytic approach to Socrates and to Plato, and I don't agree entirely with everything that he has to say, but I do respect him as an author, and I think he's worth reading. That said, something like this is going to be written in a rather, it's for an academic audience. It's written at a high level. You'll find things referenced here. It may not actually help you understand what Plato and Socrates are up to. Stanley Rosen, kind of a similar thing. Here's his excellent commentary on Plato's Symposium, way longer than Plato's book, of course, because he's going into great detail about it. Rosen is much more historically oriented, so if you read this, you'll get a lot of background on, what the references are and who he's talking about. Rosen also likes to throw a lot of his own spin in there, too, and that's one of the things with secondary literature. You're not going to find histories of philosophy that don't have a certain bent or sometimes even bias, aiming at a certain way of understanding the material, emphasizing some things, de-emphasizing other things. So, it's good to read secondary literature, but you should realize that you're relying on somebody else to tell you what to think. And so you want to approach it with that proverbial grain of salt, don't you? One of the people who I particularly like, I'm gesturing over that way because he's on my bookshelf over there, is Friedrich Cobblestone. I'll put a link to his History of Philosophy. That was sort of a standard reference guide for us back in graduate school. Again, written at a fairly academic level, but, Cobblestone at least won't steer you wrong. Sometimes he can be a little dry and dull, but he's reliable, as opposed to, say, Bertrand Russell. I wouldn't recommend his History of Philosophy for understanding Plato, or other people who reference him as well. You could go to popular literature, like Plato at the Googleplex or things like that, but that's dicey. You never know if you're getting the straight stuff. The only way to tell if the person really does understand Plato is for you to read Plato. So why not cut out the middle person and go directly to the text itself? And then go to the secondary literature and see if that helps you. If you really, really want secondary literature, again, I recommend going to your local library, particularly if you are able to access a university library, and seeing what the secondary literature is. You'll find it in the same shelf area as Plato's own writings. Or if you want to find texts online, one of the things that you can do is go to Google Scholar. You have to actually type it in, Google Scholar, and then you can find PDFs of whatever is available, academic articles on Plato, as well as all sorts of other things. Another good website for that is academia.edu, where academics tend to upload their publications. So you can find a lot of stuff for free that way. So, those are, I think, the things that people need to know the most about, the practical questions. Which dialogue should I read first? What order? What editions, what translations, and what about secondary literature? Now we get to a part of this that I'm actually much more interested in and passionate about, and that's advice about how to start. You got yourself a Platonic dialogue. You're going to read it. You're going to reread it because you're going to get confused as hell the first time around, unless you're very unusual. What are some suggestions for how to approach it, how to get the most out of it? So right off the bat, the first thing I have to say is, when you're reading philosophy, and this doesn't just go for Plato, this goes for any great philosopher, do not expect that you're going to read it the first time and you're going to get everything out of it. It just does not work that way. As a matter of fact, what makes these texts classics is the fact that they are so rich that you can go to them over and over and over again in the course of decades and still find other stuff that you might have missed or not paid attention to or downplayed, and you get a better and better picture as you do it. So the first reading, you might not even understand half of what you're reading. That's okay. Don't put so much stress on yourself that you have to grasp everything. When you're reading it, I would say give it a good, once over, read it all the way through. Don't worry about the stuff that you're not understanding. Then go back and then start, maybe taking notes or worrying about what's going on in this passage. You should also try to suspend whatever assumptions you have about what philosophy is or anything you've already learned about Plato or Socrates. It doesn't mean you have to throw it away, but just realize that you could have gotten misinformation, or you could be off base about it, or perhaps you misheard or misread something. It's also helpful not to come in with a lot of assumptions about what philosophy is or how it has to be done. Plato is one of the people who's doing philosophy long before any of us come on the scene and before any of the other people who decide how philosophy has to be done are arriving, oftentimes, taking him into account. Another thing is that Plato is writing dialogues, and I'm going to talk in a few minutes about what a dialogue requires of you as the reader. So you want to realize that there is something systematic, something valuable, something intellectual, something developmental going on in each of the dialogues. If you don't get it right off the bat, that's okay. It's there. And the more that you work at it, the better you're going to understand what's happening there. It's not going to be presented to you in a systematic form, the way it would be in a textbook. These are not intro to philosophy textbooks, these dialogues. They're not philosophical treatises. They are actual dialogues between characters who discuss ideas and sometimes get into actual arguments with each other and go back and forth and don't always finish all of their thoughts. So pay attention to what's going on. Realize that you are gradually building a map of what's happening in the dialogue, and it's a map of what's there, but it's not going to be all there on the surface, and the organization is not going to be totally apparent to you. The other thing I want to say is have some faith. Have some faith or hope or confidence, whatever it is that you want to call it. Have some of that in two things. One is in the text. People wouldn't have been reading this for years and years and years and saving Plato. Most of ancient literature we've lost. We have Plato. And people wouldn't be going back to this over and over and over again if there wasn't something valuable there. Maybe you don't get it the first time, maybe you don't get it the 10th time, but it's there. So have some confidence that if you put the work in, you will get something out of it. Put some confidence in yourself. I think that every person is capable of reading works of philosophy and getting something out of it. Not everyone will get the same thing at every given time, but everyone is able to get something out of studying philosophy, and you're no exception. With the right support, with the right advice, with the right application, you can make a lot of progress even without an academic advisor or classroom setting, you can study Plato on your own and come to understand a lot of it. The last thing that I want to stress is that what's really core at the beginning is not developing a sense of whether you agree or disagree with Plato. That happens later. What's more important is understanding. Understanding is the ground, or foundation, after which that's been laid, you can decide whether you appreciate what's going on or whether you agree with it. But if you don't understand it, you have no idea what you're disagreeing with if you disagree with it. If you don't understand it and you say, oh, I love Plato, he's so wonderful, you don't actually know what you're appreciating. The key is to develop a solid understanding of what it is that Plato is actually telling us. So those are some tips that I think could be quite helpful for you. I do also have a few things to say specifically about the dialogue form and what it offers to you and what it requires of you as a reader. And the first thing is, don't expect a dialogue to be something different than a dialogue. I already talked about this a bit. These are not systematic treatises. Even though they have a systematic structure to them, they are dialogues. They are conversations between people. They contain some parts that might be very systematic, for example, in the Republic. But a lot of the time, the conversation is going back and forth and meandering from point to point. You have to be the one who does the work to put these things together. So you actually have to follow the dialogue. That means that one of the key things that you have to be able to do is figure out who is saying what at what point. Depending on the translation that you have and which text we're talking about, you can sometimes lose the thread of that. You might want to do what they do in plays, right? And put, S for Socrates and G for Gorgias or M for Meno or whatever right next to those people. That's fine. You can deface your books however you like if it helps you out. The dialogue form requires you to distinguish between the different speakers. And the different speakers in a Platonic dialogue are different precisely because they represent different points of view. They're not just a bunch of people who are all on the same page. There are some places where Socrates is talking with Glaucon, and Glaucon is Socrates will say this and this and this, and then Glaucon says, oh yes, Socrates, I see that now. And there's some of that. But there's a lot of, well, here's what I think. Well, here's what I see wrong with what you think. Oh, really? But what about this? Oh, yeah, I get that. You have to be able to distinguish these two speakers or three speakers or five speakers apart from each other so you're not confusing them with each other. In many of the dialogues, the person who is representing Plato's point of view is Socrates, but there are even a few dialogues where Socrates is the one who's listening to somebody else explaining things. So you want to be able to differentiate between the different points of view and the different voices that are involved. Just like you would with a Shakespeare play, right? Or a more modern play, Eugene O'Neill, or pick whoever you like. The different voices are coming from different people who have different points of view and think about the world in very different ways. You also want to pay attention to who these characters are. That is why somebody, again, like if you're doing the symposium, maybe reading Rosen could be quite helpful. Plato is drawing most of his characters from people that actually lived in ancient Athens or in other environing towns, like Meno is an out-of-towner, for example, right? As is Crito. So it's important to know enough about these people that you can make sense of them. But you should also realize that, Plato is also sometimes putting his own spin on things. He's a creative writer. He is not just a philosopher, he's also a poet. He's also a dramatist. And the characters are representing sometimes types of people. So Thrasymachus in the Republic represents the type of the brash sophist, the person who comes in and has all the answers and wants everyone to shut up so he can tell his story, right? You've seen that sort of type before, I think, right? And Glaucon is the sort of person who's a young person. He thinks that Socrates has something to tell him, and he's going to squeeze Socrates until he gets the doctrines out of him. And he's even going to play devil's advocate. So it's important to attend to the characters. Another thing to think about is the dialogues often have a dramatic setting. And you don't have to, necessarily think that the setting determines everything, but it is worth paying attention to. The arguments that are contained within the dialogues, and philosophy is in very much respect about arguments, the arguments are what we could call occasioned. They don't just get made out of the blue, or because somebody wants to write something down. They're being made between people at a given point in time, and the argument will kind of meander around, and sometimes they'll lose the thread and they'll have to come back to it. They're not being entirely systematically worked out, but they are being developed to some degree. This requires something from you as a reader. You have to correlate things, especially when you're reading across different dialogues. You've got to say, oh, I saw that sort of thing being referenced back in the Phaedo. This is why it's nice to have an anthology, because you can have all the books in one place. You could be like, oh, this is about courage. Didn't I remember reading about courage back in this work here? What did he say about that? So you have to do some sort of cross-checking and some comparison and putting the pieces together. That's important for you as a reader. Now, you don't have to do it all at once. That's the good news, right? Read one text at a time. But keep in mind that you're going to find the same issues being looked at from different sides in the Platonic dialogues. The last thing I want to say about it is Socrates, as Plato's mouthpiece, will sometimes make some really bad arguments. Is that because Plato was, just stupid and didn't know any better? No, I think that the reason why we see Socrates sometimes making bad arguments is because you have to look at who he's speaking to. He's speaking to somebody who himself, generally, there's only a few female characters, can't recognize a good argument when it's being made, or isn't able to really question the grounds that Socrates is going at. But you as the reader can. These dialogues, when Plato is making a bad argument, he's expecting you to get into the conversation and say, wait a second, Socrates, what about this? That's what makes these dialogues particularly rich and productive. They can suck you as the reader into them. So that's some tips that you could say stem from the nature of the dialogue form. There are a few concerns that people often bring up that I would like to say a little bit about, because I want to not necessarily dismiss them, but at least make them not so pressing for you if you're the kind of person who gets really concerned about this. And I really have four main ones to bring up, although there could be some others as well. So the first of these is what we call the Socratic problem. Plato uses Socrates as a character in his dialogues. We think, and when I say we, I mean the people who study Plato professionally, we think that some of the dialogues do represent Socrates as he really was. They are probably things that Socrates was saying. And then we think that some other dialogues, Socrates is just being used as a mouthpiece, and Plato is attributing to Socrates and having him say things that Socrates himself probably didn't think or even think of. And then there's some stuff in the middle. And the question is, well, how do you draw the line? And the answer is, nobody actually has a cut and dried way of doing this that everybody agrees with. There is some agreement that like, for example, the Apology, that probably represents Socrates. A lot of the early dialogues, and we're going to talk about that early, middle, late problem in just a second, those are probably Socratic as well. Some things, much later, probably not. Most scholars tend to think today that the doctrine of forms, the way that Plato articulates it, that probably is not Platonic. Although, Aristotle certainly seemed to think that it was, at least in some respects. But, we don't really know. So that's one thing. The question to ask yourself is, can you read Plato's dialogues and understand what is being articulated without having to know, did Socrates himself say this historically? And the answer is yes. whether he did say it or didn't say it, it's a work of literature. It's a work of philosophy. If it helps you to instead of calling him Socrates, call him, Jim Jam from Planet Boo Boo or something like that, do that. And that'll help you not get so worked up about, oh, did Socrates actually say this? That's a separate problem that we don't necessarily need to worry about when we're figuring out what did Plato actually, think. And what is he trying to get across in these dialogues? Could be that Socrates didn't say anything about the forms, and maybe the doctrine of the forms actually is right. We're more interested in, do the doctrines themselves make sense? Now, the second thing is this early, middle, late, and you'll see this being referred to in the secondary literature on Plato, that this dialogue is obviously a late dialogue, or this dialogue is an early one, or this one is a middle one. And then they'll even break it into like early middle, late middle, and there are some really cool theories out there about that. Some of them are based on things like the stylometrics of it. Others are based on, what ideas are showing up, or when the dialogue is supposed to be said, or the degree of sophistication of it. When it comes down to it, and this is something that I devoted quite a bit of study to back when I was in graduate school, nobody really knows. I mean, we can guess that, well, the Republic was probably written later than the Apology, and a lot of the stuff in the Republic is not coming directly from Socrates himself, but we don't actually know. And the scholars who put forth theories, they often are relying on rather circular arguments in order to make this work. Do you yourself need to decide any of these things in order to read, understand, appreciate, and decide whether you agree with Plato or not? No, you don't need to worry about that. If you want to worry about it, you certainly can. A third issue that comes up, particularly in terms of the symposium, but also some of the other dialogues, is about different ideas about gender and homosexuality, and particularly male-male relations. Some people get quite turned off by that, finding out that the symposium, for example, is a set of speeches about love in which male-male relationships are featured quite heavily, and the characters themselves within the story are in fact lovers of each other. Keep in mind that Platonic love is not physical. And so Plato himself and Socrates also as a character are not actually endorsing, these very physical male-male relationships, often with incredible power differentials. That is part of the story, but it's a lot more complicated than people might present. The last thing that I think people often get really hung up on, it has to do with the Republic. Is the Republic supposed to be a blueprint for Plato's ideal society, or is this a sort of ironic gesture that goes on for pages and pages that Socrates is making? That's something we use to criticize our existing, polities and governments and those of ancient cities. Again, we don't really know. There are theories about this. You don't have to stake out a position in order to be able to appreciate the Republic. The first thing is to actually read it, and then to understand it, and then worry about whether it could be realized in real life and whether that would be a good thing or not. So those are some possible roadblocks or obstacles that I just want to say, we can register them, but you can steer around them. You don't have to make them central to yourself. The last things that I'm going to say, just to wrap this up, because this is already becoming quite an extensive discussion, is there's a few other issues that people might bring up. One of them is people ask, well, what pace should I be reading these dialogues at? And my answer to that is, well, it depends on you. It depends on the person. The key thing is that you understand what you're reading and you don't try to rush it. You can't blaze your way through and speed read philosophy. You're just not going to get that much out of it. And a text that, I can read, now I'm not going to read any Plato for the first time because I've already read all of Plato, but something that I reread and get something out of in the space of an afternoon, it might take you a day, it might take you a week, but that's because we're different people, and I've got more experience in reading this, so I can see the connections more easily, and it's perfectly fine. You can take whatever time you want. As a matter of fact, I strongly suggest doing that. Another question people ask is, well, how can I tell when I'm done reading the text? How can I tell I've put in enough work? Some people are, questioning, well, do I have to master the text? No, absolutely not. Just think about this. You wanted to read your way through Plato and just read half of his dialogues? This is a lot, We're talking about like 700 pages or so of material to work your way through. You don't need to master anything. You just need to keep making improvement. And you don't even have to only read Plato until you finish reading Plato, before you go on to Aristotle or Nietzsche or whoever. It's up to you. You're the reader. You're the one it's your education. You're the one who gets to decide. Feel empowered. The last thing that I'll say is I have been developing resources to help people understand and work their way through Platonic texts for a lot of time. And some of these are things I produced for my own students and classes, the lecture videos, handouts, recently podcast stuff. I don't have them available right now, but I will be in the near future having some online courses that will be available, some of them free and some of them very, very inexpensively. If you want to work your way through Platonic dialogues, they will be available in the Study with Sadler Academy online. There's lots and lots and lots of other great resources out there that you can access for free or you can pay for as well. Tons of courses. I'm just mentioning that I'll have my own in case that's something that appeals to you, but there's lots of other great stuff available as well. You should avail yourself of those resources. If it helps your study, great. If it supports it, that's great. If you can do it on your own, now that you've been fortified with a little bit of encouragement and you can work your way through it, more power to you. The key thing is to read Plato and just keep working at it and develop a systematic sense of what's going on in those texts and where Plato fits into the history of philosophy. And if you do that, I promise you, it will be rewarding. The last thing I'll say, every one of you are up to the task of reading Plato, so just dive in. Don't hesitate. Don't put it off till next weekend. Don't put it off till next semester or next year. Just get into it. Start studying him. Or if you have already been studying Plato, read some more. And you'll find yourself learning so much in the process.